Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be answering the question, who are the first 5 U.S. presidents and what are their accomplishments? So if you would get out your history notebook and follow along with me, we are going to take notes, writing down and copying down what is in purple on each slide. So let's get started. The first president is George Washington. George Washington was our first elected president, and he was not part of a political party when he ran for president. He was president from 1789 to 1797, and he served as president for only 2 terms, each term being 4 years, which set a pattern that other presidents followed who came after him. It wasn't until our 32nd president, whose name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to change this precedent. He was elected 4 times. Now, after he was president, the 22nd Amendment was ratified, which set a term limit for presidents of only 2 4-year terms, like George Washington. President Washington was a key individual during these formative years in our nation's history. He was president when the Bill of Rights was added to the U.S. Constitution in December of 1791. And as president, Washington helped set up the federal court system. Now, the court system has 3 tiers: the U.S. District Courts, the U.S. Courts of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court. So how does a case get from a local level to a Supreme Court decision? Well, the district courts are the lowest level in the federal system. 94 judicial districts in the 50 states and territories, and there's no appellate jurisdiction, original jurisdiction over most cases. If your case is important and a crucial decision, it will move up to the 2nd tier, which is the Courts of Appeal. And this is the 2nd federal court, higher level. It's the intermediate level in the federal court system. It has 12 regional circuit courts, including the D.C. Circuit, and there is no original jurisdiction, and it is strictly appellate. Finally, if your case moves on from the Courts of Appeal up to the Supreme Court, this is a very important court. It's the highest court in the land, the highest court in the federal system. There are 9 justices. They meet in Washington, D.C. Appeals jurisdiction through a special process and limited original jurisdiction over some cases. And George Washington's administration is the administration that set up this 3-tiered judicial system. President Washington also hired a very crucial person to the planning of Washington, D.C. as our nation's capital. His name was Benjamin Banneker. He was an African-American man who was trained as a surveyor and a scientist. And Washington asked him to design the new nation's capital city. And many of these primary sources are plans drawn from the survey records that were gotten from Benjamin Banneker, an important person in our nation's capital's history. President Washington was against political parties growing powerful. He knew that they existed. He could see what they could do in the future. He predicted that they could grow very powerful and could cause a lot of disunity in our country. He's known for 2 quotes. The first quote is about political parties, and he says, "The common mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it." Political parties often do not unite the American people together, but sometimes they cause fighting. And perhaps Washington had this in mind when he said, "Political parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government." He said this in his farewell address as he was stepping down from president and moving on. And we can see the wisdom in some of these quotes. Our second president is John Adams. John Adams becomes the president from 1797 to 1801. Now we know that many years before becoming president, John Adams had become famous for defending the Redcoats as their attorney in court for the Boston Massacre. During the Revolution, he signed the Declaration of Independence. And during the Revolutionary War, he also went to European countries, kind of like an ambassador, to ask for their help in fighting against the British. John Adams was our first vice president, and he served under George Washington. You can just put GW in your notes for short. He was also the first president to be elected under the two-party system. You can see that political cartoon down below. You can see two men tugging on either side, and they represent the two parties that were campaigning for presidential election, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Back in the day, the Federalist Party was represented by John Adams in this election, and the Democratic Republican Party was represented by Thomas Jefferson. Now, in the election, who would become president in 1797? Well, we do know that Adams won in this first election campaign. John Adams leads the U.S. in an undeclared war with France, and then he runs for re-election 4 years later, and he loses this time to his opponent, Thomas Jefferson. You can see right here some of the party issues that were being debated in the election of 1800, and Thomas Jefferson is the one who pulls through, and you can see from this map right here who voted for Jefferson statewide and who voted for Adams. Very interesting. All right, moving on to Thomas Jefferson, our third president. He served from 1801 to 1809. Before becoming president, we know that he had a very full career. He was an ambassador to France, he was the Secretary of State, and he was the vice president to John Adams. Now, back in this time period, whoever was the runner-up for a presidential election would become the automatic vice president. And that is why Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' vice president in the 4 years before his re-election campaign that he loses and Jefferson becomes the actual president. So he defeats Adams in the election campaign of 1800, like we talked about before, but this campaign was actually called the Bloodless Revolution. Jefferson's party was the Democratic Republicans, and they won a lot of seats in both the House and the Senate, as well as Jefferson himself as the president of the United States in 1800. Now, Thomas Jefferson is famous for negotiating a deal with Napoleon. As president, Jefferson saw the great lands that France had claimed out in the West. This area starts down south in the Louisiana area, and because of that, it was named the Louisiana Purchase. So he negotiates this deal, and it doubles the size of the United States and really encourages expansion. Thomas Jefferson is also president when he hires Lewis and Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase, to map it out, and to bring back information and what they find in the lands that are purchased by the United States from France. Thomas Jefferson is also famous for founding the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. James Madison is our fourth president, and he is known as the father of the Constitution. He is also known as the author of the Bill of Rights. Obviously these two documents were both argued and talked about, written about, explained by many different founding fathers, but James Madison kind of brings those ideas together, puts them in one document, and that is why he's given these two profound names. War of 1812. So I think what goes in the blank there is War of 1812, and we can see that. We just talked about that, how the White House was sadly burned during this war, how Dolly Madison was very influential in saving some of the pieces that were in the White House before fleeing, before it was burned by the British. So go ahead and write this down for James Madison and his presidency. James Madison also helps the U.S. gain respect of the nations of the world by winning this particular war against England. He causes a lot of attention to be brought to the significance of this war, And that, you know, the United States is not just an experiment, but it's an actual country, and it's a nation of the world that needs the respect of other countries. The fifth president is James Monroe, and he had served as the Secretary of War during the War of 1812. He was also the president during a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. So you see those happy people having good feelings there. You can also see that the United States flag is growing in the number of stars that are positioned there. That would be the growth of our nation as more and more states are added to the Union. James Monroe issued something called the Monroe Doctrine, and this idea, which is almost like a policy that was accepted by Congress, said that Europe should keep out of the Western Hemisphere. So this basically meant that the United States was holding its ground, and the Monroe Doctrine said hands off to any European country that wanted to gather up and gobble up land that was in the Western Hemisphere. James Monroe, as president, helped establish the African nation of Liberia as a place for freed slaves to go. You might not have known that, but that was something that he was really advocating for. And something special and unique to our President James Monroe is that he's a local resident of Aldie, and you can go visit his plantation called Oak Hill just minutes from our school. All right, now if you would go ahead and pull out your study guide, turn to the last page, and we're going to go over questions 1 through 14 as a review of what we just learned in the PowerPoint, and also to prepare for our upcoming government test. So I'm going to read the description of who this person is that was discussed today, and I want you to go ahead and fill in the blank with his or her, well, it will be his initials. Here we go. Try to beat me to it. The Secretary of War during 1812. Thomas Jefferson. Defended soldiers after the Boston Massacre. John Adams. Helped design our nation's capital city. Benjamin Banneker. Hired Lewis and Clark. Thomas Jefferson. Father of the Constitution. James Madison. Saw the Bill of Rights added. George Washington. Led the U.S. in an undeclared war against France, John Adams. Number 8, told Europe to keep out of the Western Hemisphere in his doctrine, James Monroe. Helped set up the federal court system, George Washington. Bought Louisiana Purchase from France, Thomas Jefferson. Fled the White House before the British burned it down during the War of 1812, James Madison. Founded the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson. Author of the Bill of Rights, James Madison. And finally, resident of Aldie, Virginia at Oak Hill Plantation, James Monroe. All right.